Megillah Daf Chav Dalid. Begin at the last line of Daf Chav Gimel, which is a Mishnah, and we'll have a total of 4 Mishnayos on the Daf. The first Mishnah discusses the halachos of Kriyas Torah and reading from the Navi. It'll talk about how many psukim go into each aliyah, and if you're allowed to skip. Next Mishnah will discuss who leads the tzibor in which different services throughout the minyan. Then the third Mishnah will discuss the halachos of Berachos Kohanim, and which Kohanim are allowed to do Berachos Kohanim, which aren't. And the last will tell us about different signs that indicated that somebody had descended to some form of apikarsis, and we could not let him do services for the tzibor. So let's begin. First, we're discussing the aliyos. So the Mishnah says that an aliyah should have a minimum of 3 psukim, somebody who gets up to read from the Torah. Remember, in the days of Chazal, there was not a separate Balkorah. Each Ola went and read his own aliyah. So you should not read less than 3 psukim. However, if there's a translator there who's going to translate each pasuk, so when he's reading from the Torah, he should stop after every pasuk and let him translate, because if you have too many psukim in a row for him to go back and translate, it's likely that he'll make a mistake, and then we'll learn a wrong halacha. However, when you're reading from the Navi, so there you don't have to stop every pasuk, because there aren't any halachos there, so we're not so concerned if there's a mistake. You stop every 3 psukim. Now, exception to that is, if you have different parshios, you have different paragraphs within the 3 psukim, such as if you have 3 psukim in a row that each are their own parsha, then you stop after each one and let the translator translate each parsha, even though it's only one pasuk. Now, if you want to skip, so it says as follows. It says you're not allowed to skip in the Torah, you're allowed to skip in the Navi, but you should not skip more than the time that it takes to roll for your skipping should not be longer than the translator translates. We don't want to have a situation where the tzibur is standing there and waiting for you to roll. So if you want to skip forward, so make sure that you're not rolling far enough that you'll have to keep rolling even after the translator has finished translating. Again, that's all only within the Navi. In the Torah, you're not allowed to skip forward even in that circumstance. That's what the Mishnah seems to say. So let's see the Gemara. So the Gemara says 3 psukim, Yelain, every aliyah has to be at least 3 psukim. Where do you get that from? The Gemara says it's for Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, the 3 parts of Torah Shabbat, and therefore we have 3 psukim in each aliyah. Now, when we said that if you have 3 parshios that are each a pasuk in the Navi, you can stop and have the translator translate each one. You don't do 3 psukim and then he can translate 3. So we want to know, where do you have 3 parshios that are each a pasuk long? Samara quotes from Yeshayo, Sefer Yeshaya, Parak Nun Beis, Pasuk Gimel, Dalet, and Hey. So there you have Kikayamar Hashem Mechinam Nimkartem v'lo b'chesef tiga elu. It's one parsha. Then you have Kichayamar Hashem Elokim Mitzrayim Yorad Ami v'Rishon Lo Goshen v'Ashur be'efes Ashako. And the third is V'ato mi ma li. Well, it's V'ato mi, and then the kri of mi is ma. V'ato ma li foy no'um Hashem kilukacham yechinam moishlav yehelilu no'um Hashem v'samid kol yom shemi minoi atz. So there you have the 3 parshios. Now, as far as skipping forward, so the Gemara asks, you said that in the Torah you're not allowed to skip, but we do have a situation where we skip in the Torah. When the Kohen HaGadol is doing the Avodah on Yom Kippur, so he reads in Parshas Zachar Mos, then he skips forward to Parshas Emor, and he reads from V'ach ba'asor la'chodesh. So why is he allowed to skip forward and read there? That should also be a problem of skipping. So the Gemara first wants to say, okay, so there he's skipping because he doesn't have too far to roll, and he'll be finished rolling by the time the translator has finished. The Gemara says that can't be, because we had said that that's what you have to do by the Navi. That's the only situation in which you're allowed to roll the Navi is where the translator will finish translating. Well, the translator will still be translating by the time you finished rolling. So obviously, when we said that you're allowed to do that in the Navi, but not in Torah, even if that's the situation in Torah, you're still not allowed to skip forward. So what then are we saying when you're allowed to skip forward? So the Gemara therefore says we're talking about something else. We're talking about that you're allowed to skip because they're both the same subject. If in the same subject, you're allowed to skip. The reason is that there's 2 problems with skipping. Problem number 1 is that people will stand around and do nothing. So that is solved if the translator will be translating in the meantime. So that's the rule. You can never have a situation where you're going to be stopped. The translator always has to keep translating. Now, as far as The second problem, which is that people start getting confused because you're skipping from one subject to another subject. So there we said that if it's in the Navi, it doesn't matter if it's two different subjects. If it's in the Torah, though, you can only skip if it's within the same subject, such as when the Kohen Agadol is skipping from Acher Mos to Achba Asar Lachodesh. It's all talking about Hechas Yom Kippur. So then you're allowed to skip because it's within the same subject. The Gemara supports this with a Brisa. The Brisa says you're allowed to skip in the Torah as long as it's in one subject. And another, you're allowed to skip in two subjects. You just have to make sure in both situations that you don't have dead time where you're still rolling after the translator has finished translating. We bring another Brisa. Says you're not allowed to skip in a Navi. When you're reading from the Nevi'im, you're not allowed to skip from one Navi to another Navi. You can't go from one Sefer to another Sefer. If you're in Trei Asar, that is the one set that has 12 different very small svarim within it, then you're allowed to skip from one to the other within that set of 12. And in all situations of skipping, you're only allowed to skip forward, you're not allowed to skip backwards. Right now we get to our next Mishnah, which discusses who is going to be the Chazan. So the Mishnah starts off and it says that the one who reads from the Navi, he should be the Chazan. Whether it's a full version, whether it's what we call over l'fnei hateva, a full tefillah, or it's shortened version, what we call poris al shema, he should be the one to do that. And the Gemara explains that it's because of kavod, because he did something which is not honorable. He read from the Navi, that's considered to be a bit not so honorable. Therefore, we give him the kavod of being the Chazan as well. Now, if he's a Kohen, he can also do the Birchas Kohanim, also for the same reason. Now, what if the one who read the Maftir was a child? The child is allowed to read the Maftir, so he's not allowed to be the over l'fnei hateva. He's not allowed to be the Chazan, not for a full version, not for a shortened version. So then his father or his Rebbe, in his stead, they will be the ones to be the Chazan. Because we said, the Mishnah explains, a Katan is not allowed to be a Chazan, he's not allowed to do Poris al Shema, he's not allowed to do Berchas Kahuna, Berchas Kohanim. Now, next halacha the Mishnah says is somebody who's not properly dressed is allowed to do some things and not others. So it talks about a pochach, that's somebody whose legs aren't covered. He's either wearing shorts or his leggings are torn and he's barefoot. He's allowed to be Paris Shema and he's allowed to be Metargim. So he's allowed to be the Chazan and he's allowed to translate. He cannot, however, read from the Torah, can't get an Aliyah and be the Baal Koreh, because it's not covered the Torah to read in a state like that. He also can't be the Chazan, it's not covered for the Tzibor, and he can't do Berchas Kohanim. Now, what about a blind person? So the Mishnah brings two opinions. The Tanna Kama says a blind person is allowed to be the Chazan for Shema and is allowed to be the translator. Rav Yehuda says he can't be the Chazan for Shema because he never saw the light. And the bracha of Yotzer Or and the bracha of Yotzer HaMa'oros only applies to somebody who's seen the light. If he's a person who had sight at some point and then something happened to him and he lost his vision, then he could, because he could thank Kadosh Baruch Hu for that he had before. Okay, so now the Gemara goes into the reasons. So the Gemara begins, the Gemara says, like we said earlier, the reason that the person who read from the Torah gets the other kibudim is because of kavod. And the second shot is because otherwise he'll end up with a fight. He will say, I did the reading from the Torah, I should have the right at least to be the Chazan. And because we don't want to have a fight, so we say, okay, the one who reads the Torah is going to do everything. So now the Gemara says, what's the difference between these two pshatim? Where it says the difference would be in a situation where you don't get paid for doing it. If it's because of kavod, so he still gets kavod. If you're worried about fighting, as long as he's not getting paid, there's not going to be a fight over it. So Gemara wants to try to bring a proof from the fact that we said that for a child, the father or the Rebbe should do it. That means that the fact that the Katan was the Chazan gives him rights still. He can't do it himself, but it's still because he was the one who said the Maftir, that is, he was the one who said the Haftarah from the Navi, he still has rights for it. So, if the reasoning was because of a fight, then the child is unlikely to fight with anybody. He doesn't get paid. What does he need to fight for? So, therefore, the pshat must be because of kavod. The Gemara says because of kavod also doesn't make sense. A katan doesn't need kavod, not worried about the honor of the kavod. So what do you have to say? You'll have to say no, but it's not. It's a disgrace to the father and to the Rebbe that the katan went and he did the reading from Navi and did not get the right to read, to be the Chazan and the Paras al Shema, and therefore you give it to the Rebbe in order that he should have that right. So if you're going to say that for Kavod, you can say the same thing for the fight. The father and the Rebbe could also make a fight out of it, should their Katan be the one who have read from the Navi and not give them, or not have for himself, the right to be the Chazan and then give it to them. Alright, now going on to the next halacha, which we'd seen in the Mishnah, we saw that someone who is not properly clothed, doesn't have leggings, so he cannot be the Chazan for Paras al Shema. So Gemara asked, what about a child, if a child wants to do it? Well, we know we can't do a Paras al Shema, because a child can ever do that, but child is allowed to get an aliyah, so is it considered to be not proper for a child who has this state of missing clothing, he doesn't have his legs covered, is it a problem for him to be the Ola, to get an aliyah and read from the Torah also? So the Gemara says, that's not a question. Same way you didn't ask if he was completely undressed, because you understand that that's not covered for the tzibur. You should also understand that the issue here is covered for the tzibur. It doesn't matter for the fact that he's a child. It's not covered for the tzibur that the person who's reading from the Torah is not dressed properly, even if he is a child. Okay, now on the topic of a blind man, so we saw that there was a machlokes. Rabbi Yehuda says a blind man cannot be the chazan for Shema unless he saw at some point. So the Gemara says, why is this a problem? Why does he have to have seen? Many people said drushes about Ma'aseh Merkava, the Nevuah of Yechezkel Hanavi, and they didn't see it. They never saw that. So if they could say drushes on that, so he could be the chazan for Yotzer HaMoros. The Gemara says it's different. There, it's about a question of understanding the sugya. You can understand the sugya without having seen it. If you focus and you concentrate and you learn it up properly, you can understand the sugya. Here, it's a bracha for the hana that you get from the light. You don't get any hana from the light, and therefore he cannot be the chazan unless he saw at some point. Now, what do the Rabbanan hold? Why do they say that he is allowed to if he didn't get any hana from the light? So the Gemara answers, it's like Rabbi Yossi. Because Rabbi Yossi says in a brisa that a blind person does get enough from the light. Where do you see that? Because others can help him. So let's see the brisa. The brisa says that Rabbi Yossi says, all my life I was upset. I didn't know pshat in the pasuk that says Vayisam emashish b'tzarem kasher yemashish ha'iver ba'afela, and you'll be feeling your way in high noon like a blind man in the darkness. So what's the significance of a blind man in the darkness? A blind man doesn't care if it's light or if it's dark. You want to say feeling his way like a blind man. It doesn't matter if it's light or dark. Why is it worse if it's in the dark? So he says, one day I was walking in the deep in the night, and I saw a blind man he was walking and he was holding a torch. So I said to him, my son, what are you doing holding a torch? Right? You're blind anyway, you can't see. So what's the torch do for you? So he said, no, as long as I'm holding the torch, other people can see me, and then they can help me. They can help me avoid stepping in traps, stepping in holes, stepping into thorns, stepping into thistles. And therefore, it's important that I have this light. And therefore, that is pshat in the Rabbanan, who said that a blind man can still say bracha on Yortzah, or because the light does give him the benefit of having others be able to help him. Okay, now we get to our third Mishnah on the daf. The third Mishnah discusses a Kohen who has a mum, he has an injury. So the Mishnah says, any Kohen who has something wrong with his hands should not do Berchos Kahanim. Gemara explains because people are going to be staring at it, and you're not allowed to look at the Kohen's hands during Berchos Kahanim because the Shechina rests there. So if he has an injury on his hands, he should not do Berchos Kahanim. Rabbi Yehuda says even if his hands are discolored by a plant-based dye called satis, Rashi says it's made from turmeric, he shouldn't do that also because that's also going to cause people to stare. Alright, the Gemara brings a brisa. The brisa says if he has an injury even on his hands or his feet or even his face, any malformation, he should not do Berchos Kahanim because people will stare at those, even his face or his feet, and end up seeing his hands. Yeshua ben Levi says even if he just has white spots on his hands, that's also going to cause people to stare, and he should not do Berchos Kahanim. We have a brisa as well. It says somebody who has white spots on his hands should not do Berchos Kahanim. If his hands are bent or twisted, he should also not do Berchos Kahanim. Says Rav Asi, similar halacha, somebody from Haifa or from Beit Sha'an should not do Berchos Kahanim. The reason there is because of the way they speak. Rashi says because they cannot say the words properly, so the Gemara fills it in with a brisa, where it says you cannot have a chazan be someone from Beit Sha'an or from Haifa or from Tivonin, because they mix up aleph and ayin, and they pronounce an aleph like an ayin and ayin like an aleph, and therefore when he says yo'er, it's going to sound like yo'er with an ayin, which is a different meaning for the words of Yar Hashem upon of Elecha. Rashi adds. Now, on the topic of funny voices, the Gemara says Reb Chia said to Reb Shimon bar Rebbe, if you would be a Levi, you wouldn't be able to sing in the Beis Hamikdash because you have a thick voice. So he went and he told his father, this is what he said. So he said, tell him, how is it when he says the pasuk in Yeshaya of V'chikisi LaHashem, wait for Hashem, how by you is that not Mecharfu Megadif? How you're not cursing HaKadosh Baruch Hu? How so? Because this person could not say the letter Ches, he said it as a Hey. So when he tries to say V'chikisi Hashem, he ends up saying V'hikisi, which means I will hit Chas v'shalom. So you can answer him, retort with that. Okay, the Gemara now goes back to the topic of Kohanim not to Berachas Kahuna if they have malformations. So Rav Huna says somebody who's a Zavlagan, somebody whose eyes are constantly flowing with tears, should not do Berachas Kohanim. Because again, people will stare. The Gemara asks, there was somebody in the neighborhood of Rav Huna who was a Zavlagan and he did do Berachas Kohanim. Versus that was different. People there were already used to him, seeing him all the time, and didn't have any reason to stare while he was doing Berachas Kohanim. Gemara quotes a brisa that says the same halacha. Somebody who's a zavlagan, eyes flow with tears, shouldn't have Kohanim unless the people of his town are already familiar with him. And Rav Yochanan says the same thing about a blind man, should not do Berachas Kohanim because the same reason. There's a blind man in Rav Yochanan's neighborhood who did do Berachas Kohanim. Gemara says it's different, people were familiar with him. Brisa says that as well. Blind man shouldn't do Berachas Kohanim unless people are familiar with him, in which case it's mutter. Now back to the Mishnah where Rabbi Yehuda said if his hands are discolored by ink or paint or dye, then he should not do Berachas Kohanim. The Gemara says it's a price that says it's only if this is not a widespread condition amongst the people in town. If everybody in the town worked in similar type of materials and had the same discolorations, it's not interesting, and there's no reason to prevent him from doing Berachas Kohanim. Now we get to our last Mishnah. Mishnah says there's certain people that are disqualified from leading the tzibor. Somebody who says I'm only going to be the chazan if I'm wearing colored clothing, but not if I'm wearing white clothing, or I'm not going to be the chazan if I'm wearing shoes. He's not allowed to be the chazan at all, no matter what he's wearing. And the reason is because this is the type of thing that apikarsim are worried about, and it sounds like he became an apikars, in which case we don't want to make our chazan. Now, somebody who makes his tefillin round. So first of all, it's a dangerous thing to wear round tefillin. It can end up being pressed into your skull. And second of all, you're not mekayim the mitzvah. The mitzvah it has to be square. Somebody who makes tefillin and he puts it on his forehead directly, not above the hairline where it's supposed to be. He puts it on his forehead between his eyes, or he puts the tefillin shel yad on his hand. So that's apikarsis, because he's taking the Torah's words literally. When it says beinei einecha, between your eyes, he understands that means literally between your eyes, and it says al yadecha, it means on your hand. He's not going with the drashas of Chazal where we learn that it should be on the head, above, between where the skull of the baby is soft and the hairline, and then the hand means it should be opposite the heart on the upper arm. Now, also, if he goes and he makes it out of gold, or he puts it on top of his sleeve, the sleeve of his shirt, there he's turning tefillin into an outer thing. His tefillin is supposed to be an inner thing. It's supposed to be to you, l'chol ha'os, v'l'acherim lo'os, it's supposed to be for you. And here he made it fancy and outward, made it gold, or he put it on above his clothing, and therefore he's not doing that properly either. Now, the Gemara explains the reason why we don't allow the one who has all kinds of ideas about clothing and shoes, because that's the way of apikarsim. As far as tefillin that's round, the Gemara says, is that the same thing as we saw in a brisa that the Rabbanan said, tefillin have to be square, halachal moshe misinai, and that means that when you pull the strings, you have to make sure not to pull it too tight, that you mess up the angles, and you end up with tefillin that's flatter. Is that what we are saying here as well? The Gemara says no. Here we're saying that it shouldn't be a round like a ball, but over there it's referring to where it shouldn't be oval shaped like an egg or like a bean. That's a different halacha. Here we're just saying it shouldn't be round like a ball. It's not exactly quite the same thing.